My little talk this morning is entitled Vaccination Duress. And I want us to pay attention to that question mark in the title because it's a question, are we under duress? We are in a time where there is so much uncertainty. And this is a topic that raises a lot of questions all over the world. People generally turn to law to provide some clarity on issues like this. But I want to say from the onset, as I begin this morning, that there is no clear answer in law, at least not yet. But what I'd like to do this morning is to have a discussion about rights generally. The question arises as to whether individual rights are absolute or whether they are limited in terms of what the government, any government, not just our government in Trinidad and Tobago, view as the greater good of the public versus that of the individual. So I know that there may be some questions coming out of this discussion, but I'm just going to ask that you keep them until the end of my presentation. I'm not going to be very long with the presentation itself, and hopefully we should have some interesting topics to discuss this morning and have a conversation as to what is the position going forward based on the legal framework that we have. So, of course, I don't have to remind anyone that our lives have all fundamentally changed since March 2020. But there are a few key points that I'd like to recap, just to give some context on the legal measures that have been put in place since then to curb the spread of the virus. So we know that on the 31st of January 2020, Her Excellency Paul Weeks, President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, declared COVID-19 as a dangerous infectious disease. On March 12, 2020, and we all know that date very well, Trinidad and Tobago recorded its first confirmed case of a person having tested positive for COVID-19. And by the end of March 2020, the World Health Organization declared that COVID-19 was a global pandemic affecting every single country in the world. Beginning in March 2020, a number of public health regulations were made pursuant to the Public Health Ordinance to enforce certain measures, such as the mandatory wearing of masks in public areas, which we are still doing today, limitations on gatherings. There have been limitations and then changes and then change again, public lockdowns. We are on a service this morning via Zoom rather than physically in the church, and now churches are allowed to be open again, but there's still some restriction. And of course, there was the closure of the border for almost a year and a half. We know as well that the country entered a state of emergency with a curfew on the 15th of May 2021, and this state of emergency has been extended until at least November 2021. And in light of the public health measures, all of those public health measures, the lockdowns, etc., there's been fundamental damage, some fundamental decline, in national productivity and damage to the economy, with several sectors still closed. Now, as of yesterday's update, there have been 49,688 total positive cases of COVID-19 with 1,441 deaths. And that is a very scary thing, that so many people in our country have died from this virus. And of course, we've gone through several waves of the virus, at least 3 waves. And some of our colleagues in the Caribbean, some of our neighbors in the Caribbean are now starting to experience a 4th wave. And we really hope and pray that Trinidad and Tobago is spared from a 4th wave of this virus. So that is the background. Let's talk a little bit about the vaccine situation in Trinidad and Tobago. Now, other than the public health measures, the government's biggest effort in fighting against COVID-19 has been in the procurement of World Health Organization, WHO, approved vaccines. These WHO-approved vaccines have been granted what's called emergency use authorization by the Ministry of Health in this country. We currently have 4 different brands of these vaccines available to the population of Trinidad and Tobago. I think it's AstraZeneca, Sinopharm, Johnson & Johnson, and Pfizer. One of these brands, which is the Pfizer-BioNTech brand, has been made available to children between the ages of 12 and 18. And the government has been preaching the mantra of vaccinate to operate. We've all heard this term, vaccinate to operate. And it has stated that once some threshold is met in respect of inoculations, that it would pave the way for the relaxation of restrictions placed on businesses and workplaces. Now, a target of 70% of the population has been suggested. And earlier this week, we heard about the establishment of safe zones coming in the next 2 weeks, with further details still unknown, still uncertain. They still have to work it out and communicate that to the public as to what these safe zones will look like and how that will affect legislation, etc., going forward. So that brings us to the question of the day. Can the government make COVID-19 vaccines mandatory for citizens? And what about private employers? Can private employers dictate that you must take a vaccine if you want to retain your job? This is the vaccination duress that we're talking about today. And it really is a question, are we under duress? And I'm hoping that by the end of our talk this morning, we could try to answer that question. We may have our own personal feelings about it, but at least we will understand what is the thinking of the law and how we may be able to apply that law in our own circumstances. So now we are entering the realm of the hypothetical, because as far as there is right now, there is no mandatory vaccination policy. It may be coming, but we have to think about it and speculate as to what can happen. I want to separate the position of the state or the government from that of the private sector. So I want to deal with the state or the government first. As I said, there's no law right now in place which mandate that persons be vaccinated against COVID-19. It's a broadly held scientific view that widespread inoculation of the population of any country is perhaps the only way to prevent waves of COVID-19 infections or further variants, and perhaps to bring an end to the pandemic. The present policy in Trinidad and Tobago is generally viewed as one which encourages but does not mandate persons to become vaccinated. Now, if the government were to make this mandatory, the government could very well be in breach of our constitutional rights, our fundamental rights, which are enshrined in our constitution. And three of those rights jump out right now. There's the right to equality before the law and the protection of the law, the right of an individual to respect for his private and family life, and of course, freedom of conscience and religious belief and observance. So when we look at these very fundamental rights that are enshrined in our constitution, we see that a mandatory vaccine policy could very well be in breach of that and may be open to challenge in a court based on these principles. But there's a but, and it's a big if that we have to take into consideration. And while we accept that mandatory vaccination on the face of it seems to be a violation or what's called an abrogation of individual rights, it's said that this must be balanced against the collective rights of everyone, of all citizens, such as public health concerns. Because the fact is, no right is absolute, and the law does not or should not exist in a vacuum. The question of reasonableness comes into play here. Mandatory vaccination may very well be deemed as reasonably justifiable to protect the public from a dangerous infectious disease. And there's precedent in other countries for this type of situation. And I don't want to go too much into constitutional law because it's very complicated, but in our jurisdiction, we have a provision that there can be an abrogation of someone's individual rights if it's reasonably justifiable to protect the public. And I mean, there may be a requirement for a majority, a 3/5 majority, etc. in Parliament. But the fact is, there is this avenue for the individual rights to be curtailed if it is viewed that the public or the greater good outweighs that of an individual. Maybe I could liken this to our rights. Our constitution gives us rights to freedom of speech. But even though we have the right to freedom of speech, we can't just go and say anything we want to say in any forum. We can't defame somebody's character and attack their character if that statement is untrue. There are laws to deal with that, the law of defamation, of libel and slander. We can't go on Facebook and post what we want to say about anybody. We can't, for example, threaten somebody with violence. We can't threaten the states with insurrection. I mean, we could be in breach of sedition, we could be harassing, etc. So even though the Constitution gives us a right of freedom of expression and freedom of speech, there are limits to that. So it's the same sort of analogy that we use here when we talk about our individual rights to life, to liberty, to freedom of conscience, religion and belief, respect for family life, but whether that now can be balanced against the public interest and whether the public interest would now outweigh our own rights. But the fact is, as in many countries throughout the world, this whole situation remains untested before our courts. There's not been a challenge like this. Like I said, there's no mandatory vaccination policy as yet. It may be coming, and we wait to see what will happen. If there is going to be some legislation mandating vaccines and the establishment of these safe zones, etc., this may very well provide an opportunity for someone to bring an action against the state before the court, and we wait to see how the court will deal with it. But when I say that there's no clear answer, it's still untested before our court in Trinidad and Tobago. So even though we know hypothetically what the situation may be, there's been no ruling by any court on this issue, so there's nothing to really bind us per se to any particular position. It's a wait and see approach. Let's talk a little bit about the private sector here. Now, earlier we were speaking about breaches of constitutional rights. And let me just say that when we're talking about breaches of constitutional rights, this only really applies to the state itself. An individual cannot seek redress against what's called a non-state actor, such as a private employer, for breach of fundamental rights. That's a different state of redress. That's now redress not under the Constitution itself, but maybe by virtue of your contract of employment. Because the foundation of an employer-employee relationship is the contract in place between the parties. The contract of employment provides the general terms and conditions of engagement, and it sets out the protections for the employee from the employer and vice versa. The contract, therefore, is generally confined to these terms and conditions. So if I am already employed, can my employer now tell me that I have to take a vaccine if I want to keep my job? Well, as a general rule, the unilateral imposition by an employer of any new term or condition of employment is not valid and not enforceable unless and until it's agreed to by employees. So your employer cannot just arbitrarily tell you this is now a condition of your employment unless you agree to it. It cannot be binding and it cannot be enforceable unless you agree to it. And these agreement usually comes by your express consent and mutual agreement, or where there's a trade union, for example, collective agreement where the trade union bargains on positions like that. So where an employer attempts to unilaterally vary the terms and conditions of employment, this may be deemed as a breach of the employment contract. And it can be viewed by the courts, and the court that we're talking about here would be the Industrial Court of Trinidad and Tobago, as conduct deemed to be harsh, oppressive, or contrary to the principles of good industrial relations practice. This, of course, applies mostly to permanent employees, because if you are a permanent employee, you have a contract that sets your terms and conditions of your employment. But of course, there are many people who aren't necessarily permanent employees, but they are on some kind of fixed term contract. And when the contract expires, they get a new contract. So guess what? If you are on a contract worker, and your contract expires, then the company can very well issue a new contract that has that mandatory vaccination requirement in it, because they are not now interfering with an existing contract. This is a new contract. So as a general rule, the employer may include a mandatory vaccination requirement in the terms and conditions offered to any new employees or any employee, anybody that's now taking up a new contract. And of course, an employee would then be free to accept or to reject employment on those terms. Now, that is the general industrial relations position. There's also another dichotomy to this, which is occupational safety and health. So we have in Trinidad and Tobago an Occupational Safety and Health Act, which we call the OSH Act or OSHA. And under that act, employers have a statutory duty to ensure, so far as is reasonably practicable, the safety, health, and welfare at the workplace of all their employees. This duty is not just a duty on the employer, but it also extends to persons who are not employees, but who may be affected by the operations. And employees also have a duty to take reasonable care of their own safety and the safety of others. So if we think about the workplace context in Trinidad and Tobago, we know that all sorts of protocols have been included in almost every office throughout the country. Sanitizing, temperature checks, social distancing, rostering, all measures that employers have to impose because of the occupational safety and health provisions. And this duty would extend not only to employees, but maybe the families of employees, contracted staff, clients, independent contractors, consultants, directors, visitors, proxies, what's called servants or agents and representatives, as well as other stakeholders and members of the public. So your duty is not just to your employee, but also to your customers coming in to make sure that your workplace is a safe place for them. So that begs the question, is COVID-19 vaccination reasonably required in order to ensure safety in the workplace? Can an employer say, well, in order to really make sure that my workplace is safe, I need you to be vaccinated as my employee? Because if you're not vaccinated, then you're putting the workplace at risk, you're putting your colleagues, your co-workers at risk, you're putting the customers at risk, you're putting the business at risk. There's certainly an argument that can be made in that regard. So we see again, it's not straightforward. And there has been precedent in other countries where inoculation against biological hazards have been deemed by the courts to fall within OSH principles, and particularly in There are institutions, medical institutions, or maybe people who work in care homes for the aged, people who work in neonatal units and hospitals, etc. If you work in a lab that deals with blood work and so on, your employer may very well ask that you are vaccinated against certain diseases, and those things have been tested by the court. Nothing to do with COVID-19, but generally in terms of the nature of your work. You work as a nurse in a hospital for terminally ill cancer patients. You are required to have certain inoculations so that you don't spread it in the workplace. So there is already precedent that vaccinations can fall within this reasonable duty of care that employees have to the workplace, and employers may impose those things in the workplace. So how does that really apply to COVID-19? Again, just like the government sector, the law remains untested in these areas. There have been no judgment, at least not yet, before any local court to test either, one, whether the imposition of mandatory vaccines as a new term of employment is valid in the context of a global pandemic which has impacted on business operations, or two, whether mandatory vaccinations is a reasonable requirement under the OSH principles. So again, the situation is ever evolving and uncertain, and hopefully we will see some case law being created to guide how we move forward in light of this. I think it's been widely reported that a particular trade union has indicated that it intends to take one of the major banks that's imposed a vaccination policy to the court. So we wait with bated breath to see what will happen there, because that will certainly guide where we go from here. Now, I've been talking about cases in other countries, and before I close off my presentation this morning, before we open the floor, I just wanted to look at one of these case studies, and this is a case from the Czech Republic, and it's the name of the case is Vafrica and others versus the Czech Republic. All right, so this is one of the cases that has been cited internationally in support of vaccination policies in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic. This case didn't have to do with COVID-19, but the principles that came out of this case can impact on this situation generally as we go forward. This was a case that was delivered in April of 2021, so it's very new, before the European Court of Human Rights, which is not a binding jurisdiction on our country. Our jurisdiction is bound by, of course, our local court, our High Court, our Court of Appeal, and the Privy Council. But the European Court of Human Rights could very well be persuasive on any decision of our local court. So let me give you a little bit of background about this case. The Czech Republic had introduced a compulsory vaccination program requiring children to be vaccinated against 9 diseases. And those are the diseases that we know about, measles, mumps, hepatitis, etc., which most of our children in Trinidad and Tobago get vaccinated for. But the state, the Czech Republic, introduced a compulsory vaccination program for those children, and there was a financial penalties were imposed for non-compliance, and children who were not vaccinated were excluded from preschool, not primary school, but preschool, kindergarten. So there were 6 individuals, 6 parents, six families that had not complied, and they were fined. And they brought a case before the European Court of Human Rights because they were questioning the validity of this fine, because their argument was that, well, I don't really want to vaccinate my children, so why are you compelling me and why are you fining me because I didn't do it? What they argued was that there were breaches of the European Human Rights Act, and that act has certain parallels to our constitution. So they were talking about a breach to the right to their private life. They were talking about a breach of their right to freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, and freedom of religion. And they brought this action before the court. And the court found that the Czech national vaccination program, yes, it did interfere with the rights to private life. There was no question about that. It interfered with your right to private life. But on the facts, the court also decided that the interference was justified as a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. In particular, it held that the Czech Republic had a legitimate aim in its desire to protect its population against serious diseases. So in this way, the court showed that, yes, while we understand and we accept that your individual rights exist and this is in violation of that, it has to be in violation because what is essential for the entire society far outweighs what is essential for the individual itself. Now, in this case, those vaccines were known to be safe and effective. You know, there's a question about the efficacy of COVID-19. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a scientist. I can't speak to the efficacy of the vaccines. You know, the scientists would have to speak to that, but it's not the same situation. Those were tried and tested vaccines that have been existing for many years, all right? And the court looked at the policy of that country. They said it was proportional. The fines were not excessive, and the non-vaccinated children were not preventing from attending an educational setting once they had reached compulsory school age. Now, the question is, were the children forced to be vaccinated? But the answer is no. The court didn't force anybody to be vaccinated. They were fined, and that's that. In the Czech Republic, the vaccination is a legal duty, but not compliance cannot be directly imposed, as there's no provision allowing for vaccination to be forcibly administered. And that is important too, because that is now how the court, even though they are saying that, all right, you know, your individual rights can be abrogated by the public interest, we still respect your individual rights enough that, okay, you may face a punitive measure, a financial fine, etc., but nobody's going to force you, nobody's going to hold you down and stick a needle in your arm and force you to take the vaccine. So we see these types of things coming out of this case. And later on, as we discuss, you know, we could see, I could get your thoughts as to how that could be applied to Trinidad and Tobago. So there we are. I wanted to give you an overview of the legal position that will guide the conversation on mandatory vaccination. Question remains, are we under duress? So that is a question we each have to ask ourselves. But now I'd like to invite you to participate in the discussion. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them as best as I can. Thank you.